Hi, I'm Vicky Steeves. I'm the librarian for Research Data Management and Reproducibility at NYU, New York University. I'm joined by Remy Rampal, who's a research engineer there. And you can see our colleagues in black on the slides can't be with us today, but all of this couldn't be done without them. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So reproducibility is like a hydra. There's lots of heads, lots of different problems. I think they all can be summed up by obligatory PhD comics, which is, are there instructions for how to use this code? I doubt it. Is it commented? No. Where are the files? I don't know. Is it going to be painful? Just a scratch. So there are lots of problems and lots of workflow problems, but I just want to start off incentivizing, and I'll do that briefly, which is basically, why do we care about reproducibility? So one, it's the foundation of the work we do. Even within ourselves selfishly, we want to be able to use our stuff in 5 years without it breaking. So build on top of the previous work of both ourselves and others. We want to verify correctness, so we want to be able to rerun and get the same results. Defeat self-deception, so we want to make sure that we aren't biased for ourselves as much as possible. We want to help newcomers, so if a work is reproducible, it allows folks to learn from your methodology, how you're working with code in particular. And then selfishly, to increase the impact, visibility, and research quality of your work. However, like everything, reproducibility exists on a spectrum. So Vicky Stodden gave this great report where she breaks it out into these 5 different definitions. So reviewable, just enough for peer review, but it goes all the way down to open and reproducible, which is the process and the tools are also archived alongside of code and data. So we go to a deeper level. And another way of looking at that is basically this pyramid. So the article is the tip of the iceberg. Right, the code and data also and documentation make up a large part of reproducibility, but really what gets missed is the environment. So that's like your OS and stuff. And this is basically what we colloquially call dependency hell. And this is a huge problem simply because environments are super tough to capture. You can't expect people to install all the dependencies of your work down to the operating system level. It's just a mess, and some of these things you can't even really uncover on your own. So the gap that we've identified, at least, are tools that can automatically capture all the dependencies down to the environment level, and then automatically set them up in another environment for somebody else to reproduce what you've done. So we've seen this out in the wild. So this was an article that came out in PLOS that looked at FreeSurfer. And they examined how data processing was different between workstations, FreeSurfer versions, and versions of operating systems. And they actually found significant differences between FreeSurfer and 2 earlier versions. And FreeSurfer is completely open source and available. You can check it out. But a lot of these things break in between workstations and minor version differences. So we see here it's a pretty big beast. So this brings us to a few different specific challenges, right? So there's the work and time challenges. So it's a big commitment to get all of this stuff ready. And if you're between papers, you're writing grants, if you're a grad student in your classes, this is really tough. But this is also kind of known as the incentive problem. Reproducibility can take time, and it's not valued by academic reward structure. You can see Vicky Stodden did a survey of machine learning. Carol Tenapier, which at the Beyond the PDF also documented this problem, which has since become Force 11. I recommend it highly. There's also, so we talk about these technology changes that affect reproducibility, so technical obsolescence, but also there's a bit of normative dissonance. So people say they support reproducibility and openness and don't necessarily actively practice or attempt to practice because of these kind of big challenges. So this is what I would call the pipeline challenge. Reproducibility requires skills that aren't necessarily included in most curriculums. And we can see this here again in this particular example. So what is ReproZip, which is what we are here to talk about? It's a tool developed in Python with bits of C, aimed at simplifying the process of creating reproducible things. So it can be your research, it can be applications that you write, it could be a database, it could be a website. If you do it on a Linux machine, you can package it. And what we do with ReproZip is we package things at the automatically and down to the operating system level. So we're capturing whole-scale computational reproducibility information. So that's provenance, that's data, that's libraries. So if you use a Python library, it won't only pack the library, it'll pack Python. So we're literally capturing everything that your script, your application touches during the course of its execution. So there are two steps here. So the left side shows packing, which we'll say the original researcher. So they would use, they would trace with ReproZip their experiment, and the conclusion is just a tiny reproducible package. So we haven't had one yet that's over a gig. It's very shareable. And currently that's only available on Linux. So they could upload that to a repository. Other people could download that package and then unpack it. And an RPZ file is an open generalizable format that can be read by lots of different virtualization software. So it's a pretty extensible file. So I'm going to let Remy talk about some of the super technical details for all of you. I'll switch.
Hi. So ReproZip is an open source tool. It's on GitHub. It's on SciPy. So you can just pip install it. You need a C compiler for the C parts. So how does it work? So the way it works is you run it on your experiment. And so what's going to happen is your experiment is going to run as usual, but under trace from ReproZip. So at this point, the tracer that's written in C is going to attach to all the processes of your experiment and capture in a little SQL file all the files that are needed by your experiment. So that's data files, that's binaries, that's configuration files, everything that's needed, whatever it is. So for instance, if you're running a Python script, it's not only your Python script, but it's also the Python interpreter itself, the dependencies of Python, the dependencies of your script, the C libraries, everything that's needed to make sure that on a completely different environment, you have everything you need for this to run again. And once your experiment run as usual, once it's finished, I have a bit of Python code that goes over this trace SQLite file and figures out exactly what's needed. Because, for instance, all the generated files you don't need, all the all the files that are generated and then read back, you don't have to pack because it's going to be generated and read back the second time you run it. I capture all kind of environment information, which operating system you're using, which version of Linux, all that, the environment variables, the original command lines you run, the path you were in, etc., etc. And from this, a little configuration file is generated, which is YAML, that you get to review before you pack. So this file drives the packing step. It's just a little bit more than a list of files that need to be included in this package. So it looks like this. It's YAML. It has information, for instance, here, the architecture, the command line. You can see the version of Linux, stuff like that. And so you don't have to change anything in this configuration file because it's been determined automatically that this is what you need to rerun the experiment. But if you want to change labels of some things to say, hey, this first step is, this first command line actually does this, you can do that for later reproduction. People will know what this does. You can see that ReproZip tries to identify files that are of particular interest, files that are an input, for example, for the experiment, or an output. Here you can see CSV files are recognized as input. Some plot, some PNG plot is detected automatically as output. So you get to review that if you want to. You can see it detects the packages that these files are from. So in this case, you see BLAS is here. It's going to write down the exact version number that this package is. And all kind of other files. So usually all the files from that are part of the experiment. Here you can see things that you might not have thought of packing, like this configuration file from matplotlib that you would definitely have forgotten to talk about in your paper or lab notebook. So once you have all that, you can just run ReproZip pack and you get a little package with all these files in that will definitely run in a different environment. So here's an example of packing. So it's very small, but you can see that it's a Python experiment. So instead of just running Python space, the name of the script, you just prepend ReproZip trace to that command, and that's all you have to do to run it under trace from ReproZip. And so it runs as usual, except what it's doing that is writing this SQL file and later this configuration file, and you're ready to pack your experiment. So then all I have to do is write down ReproZip pack and some file name, and it goes over this conversion file and writes into this little open file format all these files plus the SQLite trace file and this conversion file. So it's a very simple format that we can then convert to something we can rerun. So when someone receives this RPZ file, they can simply double click on it, and we have a little GUI that will let you choose how to reproduce it. And from this, you can convert this file into a CH root environment for Linux, or something like a virtual machine using Vagrant VirtualBox, or a Docker container using Docker. And you can just rerun it this way on the cloud, on your machine, like it was run initially, with the same environment, library versions, and data. So a little example here, little GUI. You just get to choose, for example, I want to use Docker. Oh, I want to use Vagrant, sorry. You get some options, like how much memory you want to use in your virtual machine, stuff like that. You just click boxes. And you click unpack, and it's going to create for you this virtual machine with all the original files in the original version, trying to pull automatically a base VirtualBox image with the same version of Linux. And once this is done, you get taken to the second tab of this little window, where you can rerun the experiment in this virtual machine as it was run the first time. So here's the path where I created this virtual machine. Here you can see all the command lines that are part of this experiment, so you can choose which one you want to run. And you get also to change the command line if you want to tweak parameters from the command line. And you just click Run Experiment, and that's it. You've run the same experiment in the same environment. So also on top of that, on top of just rerunning the same experiment in kind of this black box environment that you can't do much about, you also have the option of changing files. So you have this Manage File button that allows you to tweak this file of interest that I showed earlier in the configuration. So for instance, you can download the output files out of this virtual machine for inspection on your environment. So here you can see, for instance, you see the plot files, and you can download them as PNG to your own machines for analysis. All that from the GUI. And you can also upload your input. So if you get some experiment from someone and you have your own data you want to test out in a compatible format, you can just use from the GUI again, just replace one of the input file with your own version and test out their method on your data. So this will automatically take care of uploading this file in the virtual machine or the Docker container into the right place for the experiment to find and use. So they ran the experiment again with different input and got different results. And something we just introduced recently is we have integrated in the Jupyter Notebook. So automatically from a Jupyter Notebook, you can see here a little button trace using ReproZip. And so if you click on this little button from Jupyter, automatically you're going to create a ReproZip file that contains all the library dependencies and Python packages, but also all the data that you use in this notebook. So you can send this file alongside your notebook, and people for sure are going to be able to rerun your notebook because it's going to be run in exactly the same environment you had with exactly the files that are needed for this to run.
So basically, ReproZip can pack all your data analysis scripts and software, graphical tools, interactive tools, client-server applications, including the databases, these Jupyter notebooks, and MPI experiments, so like HPC stuff, although setting that up is a bit more involved than the 2 steps that we've shown you here. So some current use cases. So I'm going to start at the bottom of this because I think it's particularly neat. But ReproZip is being used to archive data journalism apps. So with my librarian hat on, I see all these beautiful interactive visualizations and applications being run on places like The Guardian and New York Times. But as soon as funding runs out, these things get pulled and a beautiful resource is lost. And we've seen this with a lot of different news organizations. ProPublica has a lot of great news apps. So ReproZip has been used to archive this application called Stacked Up, which was a website with a database backend, PostgreSQL, and it had a list of all the books that students need in Philadelphia and where the gaps were. So a parent could look up their child's school and see if they're missing any books, perhaps donate or buy. And it also shows the cost. So I think it's neat. It's a new application of ReproZip beyond its original intention, which I think is great. It's been integrated, so NIST is here, and NIST has created this cloud of reproducible records, or core. So ReproZip has been integrated into that platform. It's also listed on a few different reproducibility reviews and guidelines for just reviewing for academia. So some future development work, we want to have more robust support for HPC and MPI. So these systems are really complex and involve many machines. And sometimes the configuration is really dependent on the cluster. So these are very difficult things to trace. And besides, you probably need to have root permission. So one idea that we're toying around with is tracing the configuration files from these systems, like the config files from Hadoop, and then at least having the provenance of what's going on there. And then a user could use those files to correctly configure the experiment on their own cluster. But if anyone in here works with HPC all the time, we'd love to get your thoughts. We also want to pack on Mac. So we showed you the two steps. So the first, the original user packs. Right now, that's only for Linux because we capture things at the operating system level. So we want to be able to do that for Mac because there's a lot of crossover. However, we were going to use dtrace, and then Mac introduced changes that broke that approach. So we're looking into ways to get in on that. We also, so you might have noticed a bunch of slides back, we have support for this provenance graph. So people know what provenance is, right? Am I just throwing that show of hands maybe? It's a library term that's been co-opted by computer science. It's basically tracing the lineage of a process. So it originates with maybe one thing and it goes down and shows you all the files, and that's kind of a layman's definition. But you can look up, it's really interesting work going on there. So right now our provenance graph for that looks like this. It doesn't even fit on one page. So we have a student working this summer to make it D3 and beautiful and interactive so people can actually use these provenance graphs in their papers and whatever else. Because right now it's just super ugly. So you can keep an eye on that on GitHub if you're interested. So we have a few resources. So those videos all came from YouTube. So if you're interested in trying it out, you can follow along on the YouTube videos. If you go to this website, examples.reprozip.org. So we have examples from digital humanities to machine learning and everything kind of in between. A bunch of data journalism stuff as well. Bechdel test is another one for my feminists in the room. So all of this, so we'll take bash count as the first one. So all of the examples are available on GitHub with the ReproZip package. So this one is extremely tiny. And instructions on how to reproduce it. So you saw we have a GUI. You can also reproduce things on the command line. So you can feel free to follow along with those as well if you want to try it out. And then again, on GitHub, you can get us on Twitter if you want to search, and then other support. So that is the sum total of what we have. You can feel free to get this presentation after the fact on my GitLab. Thanks to Juliana, who's in Greece right now giving a data science class. But she's the PI on ReproZip and a wonderful person. And also the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan, for supporting the Moore Sloan data science environment at NYU, which is vital to the support of ReproZip. So I'm happy to take questions, general thoughts, lay it on me. Okay. will be a great one.